Imagine being trapped on an island prison during the Civil War, packed into stone cells with thousands of men, starving, sick, and crawling with lice. You can't escape. The river's freezing. The guards are watching, and every attempt could mean death. This is the Disturbing USA Iceberg, and what you just heard is only the beginning. Tier 1, 2011 Zanesville Exotic Animal Escape. In small-town Ohio, people are used to hearing gunshots during hunting season. But on October 18, 2011, the sound that rang out in Zanesville wasn't from a hunt. It came from Terry Thompson's property, and what followed was straight out of a horror movie. Starring Likens. When police arrived at his 73-acre property, they found Terry dead on the ground with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But that wasn't the main concern. The real panic set in when they looked around and realized that most of the cages were wide open and very, very empty. Tigers, lions, wolves, monkeys, bears, not one or two, but almost 50 exotic animals were gone. Just out there, roaming through cornfields and backyards like it was some kind of low-budget Jurassic Park reboot, but without the fences. Now, Terry Thompson wasn't some random guy who liked animals. He was a Vietnam vet, an exotic animal collector, and by all accounts, completely obsessed. He'd spent years gathering rare animals from auctions, private trades, and breeders, just so he could stack them up in rusty enclosures behind his farmhouse. Legal? Technically, yes, or at least for the most part it was. Ethical? Probably not. Neighbors had been raising red flags for years. They had been complaining about howling in the night, animals looking malnourished, and the occasional tiger peeking over the fence. But Ohio's exotic animal laws were so loose back then that Terry got to run his private zoo with next to no consequences, until his life started falling apart. He'd just gotten out of prison for weapons charges. His finances were in shambles and his wife had left. So on October 18, he opened every cage, lured the animals out, and then shot himself. When they realized just how much of a pickle they were in, law enforcement had to make a brutal call. Public safety first. They couldn't risk a lion wandering into someone's backyard, so they started shooting. One by one, they took out the animals. Some were running through the fields, others were hiding in trees. By the end of it, 18 Bengal tigers, 17 African lions, 6 black bears, 3 mountain lions, 2 grizzlies, 2 wolves, and 1 baboon were dead. Some sources say the monkey was never found. Lucky guy. Photos of the aftermath sparked national outrage. People couldn't believe it took this level of disaster for lawmakers to tighten regulations. Ohio scrambled to fix its exotic animal policies, but for many, it was too little, too late. And as bizarre as this is, it's nothing compared to the stretch of forest where people just vanish without a trace. We'll get to that in Tier 2. Sylvia Likens' torture and murder. In the summer of 1965, Sylvia Likens and her sister Jenny ended up in a stranger's house. Their parents worked the carnival circuit and needed someone to look after them. Gertrude Baniszewski, a single mom with 7 kids and no real income, offered to take them in for $20 a week. It was supposed to be temporary, just a bit of help until the family got back on their feet. But that house on East New York Street in Indianapolis became anything but safe. To be fair, Gertrude wasn't actually a stranger. She was a family acquaintance the Likens had met through her daughters at school, and she promised to care for the girls like they were her own. But when the weekly payments started arriving late, she got angry. And when she got angry, Sylvia paid for it. At first, it was just yelling, a slap here and there. But soon it got worse instead. Gertrude wasn't the only one involved. Her kids joined in. So did the neighbors. Actual children, some as young as 10, took part in what became an almost daily routine of abuse. They blamed Sylvia for things she never did. Stealing, lying, and acting fast. That was all the excuse they needed. She was beaten with belts, burned with cigarettes, made to eat things that weren't at all safe for consumption, stripped and mocked while other kids watched. They branded her with a hot needle and carved "I'm a prostitute" and "proud of it" into her stomach like she was property. They shoved objects into her body, forced her into boiling hot baths, and made her perform humiliating acts. It didn't take too long before Sylvia's body began to shut down. Her sister Jenny was disabled by polio, and the poor girl was terrified she'd be next, so she stayed quiet. Eventually, they stopped letting Sylvia come upstairs. They kept her in the basement, barely fed, barely clothed, and barely alive. By the time Gertrude realized Sylvia might actually die, it was too late. She tried to fake a note, claiming Sylvia had run off and had been attacked to cover her tracks. But Sylvia never made it out of that house. Her body was found on a mattress in one of the bedrooms, covered in bruises, burns, and open wounds. She was only 16. When police arrived to investigate, they weren't prepared for what they found. It wasn't just Gertrude. It was her kids and the neighbors' kids. A whole group of people had taken part in this, and an even bigger group had looked the other way and let it happen. Sadly, stories like this didn't end with Sylvia. Years later, out in the dry dirt outside Albuquerque, investigators found a whole row of women buried in the ground. We'll get to that in Tier 5. Oklahoma City bombing, April 19, 1995. On a regular Wednesday morning in Oklahoma City, a yellow Ryder rental truck parked outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. Nothing about it looked suspicious. It was just a truck sitting quietly on a downtown street. And then, at 9:02 a.m., it exploded. The bomb inside weighed over 4,800 pounds. It was a homemade mix of fertilizer, diesel fuel, and other chemicals. The blast ripped through the 9-story building like it was made of cardboard. Windows shattered blocks away. The street itself cracked open, and a 30-foot crater opened up under what used to be the front entrance. In seconds, downtown Oklahoma City looked like it had been hit by an airstrike. In total, more than 600 people were injured, and 168 people were killed. 19 of them were kids from the building's daycare center that just happened to be right above where the truck was parked. In 1995, it was the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. The man behind it all was Timothy McVeigh, a 27-year-old Gulf War veteran with a deep grudge against the U.S. government. He was obsessed with Waco and Ruby Ridge, 2 federal raids that ended in bloodshed, and he saw the bombing as payback. He didn't just want destruction, he wanted a message. McVeigh wore a t-shirt that quoted one of the men who stabbed Julius Caesar. It read, "Sic semper tyrannis," which translates to, "Thus always to tyrants." In his car were pages from the Turner Diaries, a racist novel that literally describes bombing a federal building. And no, parking the truck under the daycare wasn't a mistake. He knew. What's wild is that he didn't put a lot of thought into his getaway plan. About 90 minutes after the bombing, a state trooper pulled him over for driving without a license plate, then found a loaded gun. McVeigh was arrested on the spot. Days later, FBI matched him to the bomb materials and the Ryder truck rental. His accomplice, Terry Nichols, was arrested soon after. But McVeigh was the one who lit the fuse, and in 2001, after a high-profile trial, the government executed him by lethal injection. Oklahoma has seen some dark stuff, but wait until you hear about the teenager who went on a killing spree with his girlfriend in Tier 2. In the meantime, let's go over an incident that might make you start seeing your partner a little differently. The murder of Suzanne Morphew. At first, it seemed like the setup for a made-for-TV mystery. A clear spring day, a peaceful mountain town in Colorado, and a mom who disappears without a trace on Mother's Day. Prime TV material. But this time, it was very real. Suzanne Morphew was last seen near her home in Salida in May 2020. Her bike was later found tossed into a ravine. Then her helmet turned up nearby. But there was no blood, tire tracks, or really anything that could help the investigation. Her husband, Barry Morphew, did everything you'd expect from a man whose wife had just gone missing. He stood in front of cameras looking heartbroken, begged the public for help, offered a reward, and even sat down for a few interviews. But off camera, things weren't adding up. Suzanne had been texting friends for months about wanting to leave him. She said she felt trapped in the marriage. Which brings us back to Barry. He wasn't exactly your average husband or guy for that matter. He was a deer hunter with access to a tranquilizer cocktail strong enough to drop a fully grown elk in seconds. The stuff's called BAM. It's a mix of 3 powerful drugs used by wildlife officials, and Barry just so happened to have a prescription for it. He also happened to be the last person to see Suzanne alive. Investigators thought they had enough to charge him, so in 2021 they did. Their theory was that he used BAM to knock Suzanne out, got rid of her, and staged the bike scene. But then the case fell apart. The prosecution rushed everything, withheld evidence, and ignored details that didn't fit their theory, like the unknown male DNA found in Suzanne's car. It didn't match Barry. And so, just like that, the charges were dropped in 2022. For a while, it felt like the case was over. But in late 2023, Suzanne's remains were found by accident. A team searching in a remote area of Moffett stumbled on a shallow grave, and there she was. Her body had been there for years, still dressed in her biking clothes. When experts examined her remains, nothing obvious stood out. There were no gunshot wounds, stab marks, or any signs of a struggle. So they looked deeper. Inside her bones, they found traces of BAM, that wildlife tranquilizer her dear old husband just so happened to have access to. In 2025, Barry Morphew was re-indicted. There's still no confession, no witnesses, and no clear story about what happened that day. But one thing's for sure, Suzanne didn't just ride off and vanish. 3 Mile Island partial meltdown. At 4 a.m. on March 28, 1979, inside the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, a valve jammed open, and that was it. One valve got stuck, and everything started spiraling. It was part of the cooling system on reactor unit 2. The valve was supposed to shut once the pressure dropped, but it didn't. So instead of keeping the system sealed, it let water escape. The water that was supposed to cool the reactor core just kept draining out. And the worst part was the people running the plant didn't realize it. Control room indicators showed the valve as closed. When they finally realized something was wrong, operators misread what was happening. They actually slowed down the emergency cooling system, thinking the reactor had too much water. In reality, it was almost dry, and without coolant, the uranium fuel rods inside the reactor started overheating. The metal cladding around the rods began to warp and melt. Radioactive gases leaked out, and eventually, the uranium fuel itself started breaking down. By the time someone figured it out, part of the reactor core was partially melted. Then it got worse. As the heat built up, hydrogen gas collected inside the containment structure and caused a small explosion. As a result, radioactive steam vented into the air. Locals reported seeing a strange mist above the plant and getting a weird metallic taste in the back of their throats. Over 100,000 people packed up and left. They didn't wait for the government to tell them whether it was safe. Officials tried to calm everyone down, saying no one had died, the radiation was low, and that things were under control. Technically, they weren't wrong. No immediate deaths were linked to the accident, but people still wonder what damage was really done. Cleanup took over a decade and cost roughly $1 billion. Unit 2 was permanently shut down. Tier 2. Bennington Triangle Disappearances. From 1945 to 1950, something strange kept happening in the woods of southwestern Vermont. It wasn't a monster or a cult or anything like that. It was people. Ordinary people who walked into the forests around Glastonbury Mountain and never came back. The first to vanish was Mitty Rivers, a 74-year-old local who knew the area like the back of his hand. He was out near Bickford Hollow on a hunting trip when he just disappeared. Search teams combed the woods for weeks. The military even showed up, but all they ever found was his handkerchief. It turned up months later in a spot that many say had already been searched. That's not creepy at all. A year later, it happened again. Paula Weldon, an 18-year-old college student, told her roommate she was heading out for a hike on the long trail. She wore a red jacket that was bright enough to spot from a mile away, but didn't take a bag, food, or even a coat, even though it was freezing outside. Witnesses saw her walking along Route 9, but after that, it's like she vanished into thin air. Her disappearance was such a mess that Vermont eventually created its own state police force in response. Then came James Tedford, a war veteran living in a local retirement home. On December 1st, 1949, exactly 3 years to the day after Weldon's disappearance, he boarded a bus back to Bennington and was seen by multiple passengers during the ride. But when the bus pulled in, he was gone. His luggage was still on board and his timetable was open on his seat. Some reports say he vanished without even getting off the bus. Others think he stepped off at one of the stops and never made it back. Either way, it doesn't make a lot of sense. The fourth case happened in October 1950. Paul Jepson, an 8-year-old boy, was sitting in his family's truck while his mom fed pigs on their farm. When she came back, he was gone. Bloodhounds picked up his scent, followed it to a crossroads near Glastonbury, then lost it completely. Some people say he was taken. Others think the land itself swallowed him. The red jacket he was wearing never turned up either, just like Paula's. 2 weeks later, 53-year-old Frida Langer was hiking with her cousin when she slipped into a stream and went back to their campsite to change clothes. She never made it back. This time, there was a body, but not right away. Frida's remains were found 6 months later in an open field that had already been searched more than once. No one could say how she died, and the decomposition was too advanced to figure it out. That was was the last disappearance tied to what people now call the Bennington Triangle. It's not an official name, but it stuck, partly because there's no real explanation for what actually happened to those 5 people. Some of them were experienced hikers, and others disappeared in broad daylight. No bodies were ever found, except Frida's. So, you see, it's quite the mystery. Today, the area around Glastonbury is mostly abandoned. The mountain itself was once home to small logging towns that faded out after the industry dried up. But even when people lived there, locals said the place felt off. Getting lost in the woods is scary, sure. But what happened to an entire village centuries ago? That's in Tier 4, and it's the kind of stuff that'll keep you up at night. Starkweather Fugate killing spree. In 1958, Nebraska found itself in the middle of a real-life nightmare, and it all started with a scrawny 19-year-old called Charles Starkweather, who was angry at just about everything. He grew up in Lincoln with a speech impediment, a messed-up leg, and a permanent grudge against the world. Kids picked on him, teachers ignored him, and his own dad wasn't exactly gentle. Once he hit his teens and started lifting weights, he stopped getting pushed around and started pushing back. Charles felt like life had cheated him. He hated anyone who seemed happier, richer, or more respected. In his words, dead people are all on the same level. So when he finally snapped, it wasn't some heat-of-the-moment thing. He meant it, and he didn't go alone. He brought his 14-year-old girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate, with him. The spree kicked off when Charles tried to buy a stuffed animal on credit at a gas station. The clerk said no, so Starkweather came back later and shot him dead. That was murder number 1. Nearly 2 months later, on January 21, 1958, he went to Carol's house and killed her mother, stepfather, and 2-year-old baby sister. He shoved their bodies into a chicken coop and stayed in the house with Carol for days, who claimed he had held her hostage. Others say she was in on it. Either way, once they left, the body count only got higher. They killed a family friend just for knowing them. Then a teenage couple offered them a ride. They ended up in an abandoned storm cellar. The boy was shot in the back of the head while the girl was left alive because Charles had plans for her. But it didn't stay that way for long. She put up too much of a fight, and her captors didn't like that, so she also caught a bullet. In Lincoln, Charles and Carol broke into a wealthy family's mansion and killed the housemaid, stabbed the wife, shot the husband, and broke the family dog's neck, just to keep quiet. They packed up stolen jewelry, cut out newspaper photos of themselves, and drove off in their victim's shiny black Packard. Panic spread fast. Everyone was on edge and armed. Roadblocks started popping up all over town, and some folks even formed vigilante groups, but none of it stopped the spree. Instead, it kept going until they finally reached Wyoming. There, they murdered a traveling salesman and tried to steal his car, but when it stalled, a good Samaritan pulled over to help. Starkweather tried to kill him too, but before he could finish the job, a deputy rolled up. Carol ran straight toward the cop, screaming that Starkweather was going to kill her. Charles took off in the car, but after a short chase, he pulled over because he was convinced he was bleeding out from shattered glass. He wasn't, but the drama was over. Starkweather was executed in the electric chair the following year. Carol was sentenced to life, but walked free after serving 17 years. To this day, people still argue about whether she was a terrified kid or just as guilty as he was. Either way, there's no denying that this killer couple left behind a trail of bodies, chaos, and one of the darkest stains on Nebraska's history. 1927 lynching of John Carter. In the spring of 1927, Little Rock felt like a city holding its breath. The Mississippi River had been flooding nearby towns. People were getting pushed out of their homes, and the tension across the South was thick enough to cut with a knife. Folks were nervous, paranoid even, and that's when everything went from 0 to 100. It started with a murder. A young white girl was found dead in a church, and not long after, a black janitor named Frank Dixon and his teenage son were arrested. There was no solid evidence they were involved. All the authorities really knew was that they'd been nearby when it happened, but apparently that was proof enough. To keep them from being lynched by an angry mob, police quietly moved the father and son from jail to jail. But the tension didn't die down. It just waited. Then, out of nowhere, a second story hit the streets. A black man named John Carter had allegedly taken advantage of a white woman and her daughter. Nobody saw it happen, but it didn't matter, because no one asked questions. Carter didn't even get a chance to defend himself. A white mob found him on the outskirts of town, and that's when the assault started. They beat him with pistols, dragged him to a telephone pole, and hanged him. When they were done, they shot his body full of bullets, just to be sure. At that point, they could have stopped, but they didn't. They cut him down, tied his body to a car, and dragged it through the streets of Little Rock. It didn't matter that it was the middle of the day or that he was already dead. After some time, the mob drove straight into West 9th Street, which was the center of the black business district. Then it got worse. They tore pews out of a local church and stole wood from nearby stores. Once they had enough, they built a bonfire right in the middle of the street and threw Carter's body into it. Reports say thousands showed up to watch, but even after the fire, it still wasn't over. At least one person who was there that day claimed they saw someone use the burned remains of Carter's arm to direct traffic. If you're wondering where the police were during this, because, it's kind of their job to stop things like this from happening, well, your guess is as good as mine. What we do know is that they stood by and didn't do anything to stop it. Some sources even say that the officers present were busy taking pictures. By the time the National Guard arrived, the crowd was gone. No one was arrested and no one was held accountable. The city just swept up the ashes and kept it moving. Or at least the white people did. After the incident, several black families packed up their things as quickly as they could and ran as far away from Little Rock as possible. Homes were left behind and businesses were abandoned. What official records labeled as a riot was really a public lynching of a man who was, by all intents and purposes, innocent. For years, Arkansas acted like it never happened, but it did, out in the open, with thousands watching. And as horrible as this was, another town you'll see in Tier 5 took things even further. They didn't just kill people, they ran them out of town and took their property. But first, let's talk about two brothers who went on a killing spree together. Wichita Massacre. In December 2000, two brothers, Reginald and Jonathan Carr, showed up in Wichita, Kansas. At first, it was petty crimes, robberies, carjacking. Still awful, but not headline news. But it didn't stay that way. What started small quickly turned into one of the most brutal and senseless killing sprees in recent U.S. history. Their first known victim was a baseball coach. They robbed him at gunpoint and roughed him up, but he survived. Then, they killed a local librarian in her driveway, just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. As scary as that sounds, they were just getting started. On December 14, the Carrs broke into a home in a quiet Wichita suburb. Inside were 5 young professionals, close friends in their 20s, hanging out after work. One of them had just bought an engagement ring. He planned to use it that night when he proposed to his girlfriend. Instead of whatever fun activities they had planned for the night, the group was held at gunpoint, stripped naked, and forced into acts so disturbing they barely sound real. The Carrs forced the men and women to violate each other while they watched, and then they joined in. After that, they ransacked the house, grabbed anything of value, wallets, jewelry, bank cards, whatever they could find. Then they marched everyone out into the cold. They drove the victims to a snowy soccer field, lined them up, and shot them execution style, one by one. Then, just to be sure, they ran over the bodies with a truck. But one woman survived. Her name was Holly G, and the only reason she lived was because her plastic hair clip got in the way of the bullet that was supposed to kill her. She was naked, injured, and in sub-zero weather, but she got up and ran for over a mile in the dark. She finally made it to safety and told the police everything. While Holly was fighting for her life, the Carr brothers went back to the house and beat the victim's dog to death with a golf club. And if you're wondering why the hell they would do that, well, that makes 2 of us. The brothers were caught within days. Both were convicted and sentenced to death, but the case dragged on for years, bouncing through appeals and court battles, all the way up to the Supreme Court. If you think this is one of the worst home invasion cases, wait till you hear about the one where a whole family was wiped out in one night in Tier 3. 1998 Thurston High School shooting. On the morning of May 21, 1998, students at Thurston High School in Springfield, Oregon were sitting in the cafeteria, eating breakfast, and talking about whatever high schoolers talk about before first period. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary until a 15-year-old named Kip Kinkle walked in with a rifle and 2 handguns and opened fire. He shot 27 people. 2 students were killed, and the rest were injured by bullets, flying debris, or just the sheer chaos that broke out. When his gun jammed, a group of students tackled him and held him down while he screamed for someone to kill him. It all ended quickly, but the damage was done. And as bad as that sounds, it gets worse. The night before, Kip had murdered his parents. He shot his dad in the back of the head, then waited for his mom to get home and shot her 6 times. He dragged their bodies into separate rooms, covered them with sheets, and just stayed in the house, alone, listening to opera music on repeat, like he was trying to drown something out. That something was the voices. Kip had been hearing them for years, and they kept telling him he was worthless and that he should hurt people. He tried to fight them off with music, violent fantasies, basically anything to shut them up, but nothing worked for long. His parents had tried everything too, including therapy and medication. They even bought him guns, thinking it might help, a decision that would later come under intense scrutiny. Kip fired 51 rounds into the cafeteria that day before he was stopped. Later in custody, he pulled a knife on an officer and begged them to shoot him. He really wanted to die, but he didn't get his wish. Instead, he was sentenced to 111 years without the possibility of parole. After a round of evaluations, Kip was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, which honestly makes some of his behavior make a lot more sense. As of now, he's still in prison, still hearing the voices. Tier 3. Salem and Witchcraft Hysteria. In 1692, Salem, Massachusetts was a strict little Puritan village where everyone watched each other a little too closely. Life was hard, people were tense, and religion controlled just about everything. So when 3 girls suddenly started having weird fits, complete with screaming, twitching, and collapsing, the town didn't ask too many medical questions. A local doctor looked at them and said they were bewitched. That was all it took. The girls pointed fingers at 3 women, including an enslaved woman named Tituba. And just like that, the panic kicked off. More people got accused, then more. Then it snowballed. Families turned on each other. Kids testified against their own parents, and in less than a year, over 200 people had been accused of witchcraft. The trials were a disaster from start to finish. You could be convicted based on spectral evidence, which meant if someone said they saw your ghost in a dream, that was enough to land you in court. It didn't stop there. If your crops failed, if a storm hit, if you looked at someone funny, that also meant you might be a witch. People were hanged based on nothing. 20 people were executed in total. 19 were executed by hanging, and one man, Giles Corey, was slowly crushed to death with stones because he refused to enter a plea. They kept piling rocks on him until his chest gave out. Pregnant women were accused. Old women, too. Children also weren't safe. As a result of these wild allegations, dozens of people died in cold jail cells, waiting for trials that never happened. And while everyone blamed witchcraft, historians point out that land disputes and personal grudges also played a big role. Accusing someone of witchcraft could lead to their property being seized. So some people definitely used the hysteria to settle scores or grab land. Why file a lawsuit when you can just scream witch? It finally ended when the accusations got a little too bold. Someone went after the governor's wife, and that's when he stepped in and shut the whole thing down. The court was dissolved. The trials stopped. And years later, Salem issued an apology. A few people were even legally cleared, but by then, it was way too late. The Salem witch trials weren't just about superstition. They were about fear, power, and how fast things can fall apart when people stop thinking and start accusing. And even now, over 300 years later, it's still one of the clearest examples of what mass hysteria can really do. The witch trials are pretty popular, but there was a real-life massacre on Election Day that barely anyone talks about. That's all the way in Tier 5. For now, let's rewind a bit and get into all the messy details behind what's considered America's first recorded ghost story, Nelly Butler. In 1799, something strange started happening in the coastal town of Sullivan, Maine. It wasn't a full-blown haunting at first, just weird whispers, muffled voices, and strange knocking noises in the basement of Captain Abner Blazedel's house, like someone was buried under the floor and was now trying to get out. The family brushed it off. They blamed the strange sounds on the wind, rats, or just the house settling. But then, on January 2, 1800, the voice spoke clearly, like someone was standing right in the room with the Blaisdell family. When Abner, who wasn't exactly the type to scare easy, being a Revolutionary War vet and all, asked who it was, the voice responded saying, "I'm the dead wife of Captain George Butler, born Nelly Hooper." Nelly had died young, at 21, during childbirth. Her baby died too. And now, apparently, she was back, haunting the cellar of someone else's house. At the center of it all was Abner's 15-year-old daughter, Lydia. She was the only one who could reliably hear Nelly, and she kept getting drawn back to the cellar like something was pulling her in. Then it got weirder. Nelly started making demands. She wanted her former husband, George Butler, who was 29 at the time, to marry Lydia. That's when people started paying attention. Word spread fast. Neighbors came to the house claiming they heard the ghost too. Some even said they saw her glowing, wrapped like a corpse, drifting through fields or floating just above the basement floor. One man swore he tried to touch her, and his hand went right through. Oh, and she didn't just appear. She talked too, a lot. Some people said she quoted Bible verses, and others said she warned them that their souls were at risk. Some of the townfolks thought it was really Nelly, but others thought it was something darker using her voice. But all of that didn't really matter because George Butler himself believed it. He married Lydia in May, just like the ghost asked, and less than a year later, she died in childbirth, just like Nelly. The baby didn't make it either, and after that, the ghost of Nelly Butler went MIA. There were no more sermons from her, and she stopped making appearances. It's considered the first recorded ghost story in American history. Not because it was the first haunting, but because so many people witnessed it, wrote about it, and swore it was real. Whether you think it was a restless spirit or something more manipulative pretending to be one, the end result was the same. Upstairs Lounge Arson. On a Sunday night in 1973, a group of friends gathered at the Upstairs Lounge in New Orleans, French Quarter. It was a laid-back gay bar on the second floor of a building on Iberville Street that had cheap drinks, a jukebox, a piano, and regulars cracking jokes. That night, they were talking about raising money for kids with disabilities before things went south. At 7:56 p.m., someone rang the doorbell downstairs. Without putting too much thought into it, one of the men walked over to buzz them in. He probably figured it was a cab or something like that, but he was wrong. In a matter of seconds, the entire staircase exploded into flames. The killer had poured lighter fluid and lit a match, turning the only public exit into a wall of fire. Within seconds, thick black smoke filled the bar. People screamed and started to panic. Some tried to make it to the roof. A few made it out through a back exit, but most of the guests didn't stand a chance because the windows were barred. Trapped and choking, people clawed at the glass as they burned. One man squeezed through the bars but fell to the ground, still on fire. Others burned alive while bystanders watched. The body of Reverend Bill Larson was found hanging from the window bars with his arms still wrapped around the metal. He stayed like that for hours, in full view of the street below. 32 people died that night. Many of them were so badly burned, they couldn't even be identified. And while the fire itself was horrific, what came after was somehow worse. Most churches refused to hold funerals. Families refused to claim bodies, and local news outlets barely covered the incident. There were no candlelight vigils or public statements. The city just moved on. Police questioned a man named Roger Dale Nunez. He was a drifter with a violent record who had been kicked out of the bar earlier that day, so it made sense that he was considered a suspect. On top of that, he actually admitted to his friends that he started the fire, but he was never charged. A year later, he unalived himself. The case was swept under the carpet without proper investigation or any real answers, and no one batted an eye because the victims were gay men in 1970s America. The building was eventually repurposed, and the bar was forgotten. The Upstairs Lounge arson was an intentional act of violence. But sometimes disasters hit out of nowhere, and as you'll see in Tier 4, sometimes they hit twice. Cleveland School Fire. On May 17, 1923, the little wooden schoolhouse southeast of Camden, South Carolina, was filled to the brim. It was the last day of school, and almost 300 people had crammed into Cleveland School for a student play called Topsy Turvy. The show was meant to be lighthearted, a comedy that would serve as one final celebration before the building closed its doors for good. Families showed up in their Sunday best. The walls were lined with oil lamps for stage lighting, and the kids were fidgeting in their seats, probably more excited about summer break than the play itself. It was all going fine, until it wasn't. Near the end of the show, one of the oil lamps fell. It crashed onto the stage, and the burning oil spread instantly. Men in the audience tried to smother the flames with their coats, but it was too late. The fire had already spread to the stage curtains, then up to the ceiling. At this point, everyone knew they needed to get out, fast. They all rushed for the stairs, which was the only way out, and that's when things went from bad to completely irreversible. The stairway turned into a choke point. People piled on top of each other, clawing, screaming, and trying to get through a doorway that just couldn't fit that many bodies at once. Then the wooden stairs, under all that weight and fire, gave way. The whole thing collapsed. Over 100 people were thrown to the ground floor in a tangle of limbs, smoke, and burning wood. Some suffocated, others were crushed, the rest burned alive. A few people jumped from second-story windows to escape. Some of them made it out with broken bones, while others didn't make it out at all. By the time the fire burned itself out, less than an hour later, the school was gone. 77 people died that night, and sadly, most of them were children. Only about a quarter of the bodies could be identified. The rest were buried in a mass grave nearby, because there was no other way to tell who was who. No one expected a farewell play to turn into one of the deadliest school fires in U.S. history, but it did. Villisca Axe Murders. In 1912, the town of Villisca, Iowa, was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors and everyone knew everyone else. That changed overnight. On June 10, 8 people were found dead inside the Moore family home. Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, their 4 kids, and 2 friends who had stayed the night, Lena and Ina Stillinger. All of them were murdered in their sleep with an axe. The entire house turned into a crime scene overnight, and it's still one of the most brutal and confusing cases in American history. The killer didn't just attack and leave. He went from room to room, swinging hard enough to shatter skulls. Josiah was hit in the face so many times that in the morning, there wasn't much left to recognize. Even the children weren't spared, and just to make sure, the killer came back around to hit them again, after they were already dead. The axe used to commit the gruesome crime wasn't some weapon brought in from the outside. It belonged to Josiah, and while that's creepy enough on its own, the crime scene had even weirder details that still don't make sense to this day. For starters, every mirror in the house was covered, and the windows were draped with clothes. There was a bowl of bloody water in the sink that made investigators think that maybe the killer washed up after. And to top it all off, a 4-pound slab of bacon was found just sitting on the floor next to the axe. And no one knows why. It wasn't stolen, it wasn't eaten, it was just there. Police also found 2 cigarette butts in the attic, meaning the killer might have been in the house the whole time, just waiting for the family to fall asleep. And then there was Lena Stillinger. Her body was found in a strange position. Her undergarments had been removed and her leg was placed in a weird position. Investigators thought it looked staged, like someone wanted to send a message or do something more sinister, but they could never prove what happened. What made things even worse was how the scene was handled. The townspeople practically flooded the house. Neighbors walked through the blood, touched the bodies, and even took pieces of the victims' skulls as souvenirs. By the time the authorities tried to secure the crime scene, it was already ruined. Dozens of suspects were questioned over the years. Jealous rivals, angry drifters, even a traveling preacher who confessed and later took it back. But nobody was ever convicted. The case went cold, and it stayed that way for more than a century. Now the Moore house is open to the public. You can actually pay to spend the night there. Some people do it for the thrill. Others swear they hear footsteps, whispers, or see shadows moving around. Either way, it's still the place where 8 people went to sleep and never woke up. And nobody ever found out who did it. Tier 4. Brunckhow's Cabin. The bloodiest cabin in Arizona. At first glance, there's nothing too special about the ruins of Brunckhow's Cabin. Just some crumbling stone walls sitting out in the Arizona desert, baking under the sun like the rest of Tombstone's leftovers. As far as we know, there are no signs and no fences. Nothing to suggest it once earned the nickname, the bloodiest cabin in Arizona. But give it time. The longer you look into this place, the messier it gets. The story starts back in 1858 with Frederick Brunckow, a German mining engineer who came to the American Southwest chasing silver. He brought a small crew with him, a chemist, a cook, and a few miners, and they set up camp in the San Pedro River. The plan was simple: dig, strike silver, get rich, and get out. But that's not what happened. Instead, one of his men returned from a supply run to find the place ransacked. To begin with, Brunckow was dead. His skull had been crushed with one of his own tools. The rest of the workers were either murdered or missing. The cook was gone. The livestock was nowhere to be found, and their supplies had also vanished. Sadly, no one was ever arrested. The authorities concluded that it was the work of the Apaches, a group of Native Americans, or disgruntled workers who had it out for Brunckow. Blaming the Apaches sort of made sense because they were actively raiding and attacking settlers in the area at the time. The initial reports from the cabin mentioned fresh graves and stolen goods, which, to be fair, did line up with their usual playbook. Brunckhow's cook countered this by saying a group of Mexican laborers were responsible. But honestly, no one really knew for sure what went down that day. And that was just the first bloodbath. Over the next few decades, things only got weirder. Everyone who tried to settle near the cabin seemed to end up dead one way or the other. Some were shot, others were stabbed. A few were just found face down in the dust with no clear cause of death. One U.S. Marshal was gunned down right on the front step during a land dispute. Others died in fights over silver claims or stolen goods. Some deaths were pinned on the Apaches, others on bandits, rivals, or even ghosts, depending on who you asked and how drunk they were. In total, more than 20 people were killed in or around that little stone building between the 1860s and 1890s, and a lot of them were buried right there. Today, all that's left of Bruncko's cabin is a half-collapsed ruin surrounded by desert silence. But the stories haven't faded. Some say the land still feels heavy, like it's holding on to everything that happened there. Others say it never stopped. Either way, the next time you're out near Tombstone and think about pulling over to explore, maybe think twice. Fort Delaware Prison Hell. From a distance, Fort Delaware doesn't look like much. Just a giant stone fortress sitting on an island in the middle of the Delaware River. But back in the 1860s, it wasn't exactly a sightseeing spot. It was where the Union held Confederate prisoners during the Civil War. Not every camp was like this, but this one was the stuff of nightmares. Originally built in 1859 to guard the Philadelphia and Wilmington ports, Fort Delaware was supposed to be a symbol of military strength. Instead, it somehow became a prisoned island where thousands of men were left to rot behind stone walls. After the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, things got out of hand fast. The Union flooded the fort with around 13,000 Confederate prisoners of war, even though the space was only built to hold maybe a third of that. The cells were cramped, the water was foul, and the food, well, let's just say that hardtack was better suited for repairing fences than feeding humans. The beef and bread were just as bad, and more often than not, meals were served with a side of weevils. Needless to say, sickness spread fast. Smallpox, scurvy, dysentery, and lice didn't just pass through, they moved in. One Confederate soldier described seeing prisoners covered in so many lice that it looked like their clothes were moving. Another said the prison stank of death. Some men literally wasted away in their bunks, but they couldn't even do that in peace because the bunks were overrun with rats. So if the living conditions were that bad, why didn't people just escape? Well, because it was nearly impossible. And the ones who did try learned that the hard way. One man waited for the river to freeze, then skated across it. Another faked his own death, hid inside a coffin, and slipped out with the bodies. A few tried swimming for it, but they were either shot, dragged under, or swept away by the current. Around 2,900 prisoners died inside Fort Delaware, and they weren't treated any better in death than in life. Their bodies were ferried across the river and buried in trenches at Fort Mott, New Jersey, with no gravestones. After the war, the survivors didn't have anything good to say about their time at Fort Delaware. Most just want to forget it ever happened. Problem is, the place didn't go quietly. Today, Fort Delaware is a state park. There are ferry rides, historic tours, even reenactments. But when the fog rolls in just right, and it's late enough, visitors swear they hear the sound of bodies being dragged across the floor. Okay, so that's pretty dark. And if you think being stuck in a Civil War prison is as bad as it gets, you're wrong. Because there's a town coming up in Tier 5 that people swear is cursed. La Conchita Landslides. 1995 and 2005. La Conchita, California. Looks like one of those towns people daydream about when they say they want to get away from it all. It's a quiet little stretch of beach between Santa Barbara and Ventura with waves on one side, cliffs on the other, and not much in between except palm trees, surfboards, and peace. But what most people don't realize is that the town is basically stuck in a geological sandwich, and the top layer doesn't like staying put. Back in 1995, after months of relentless rain, the cliffs behind La Conchita finally gave out. The land slumped forward, like a giant finally rolling over after a long nap. As a result, 9 homes were destroyed. Miraculously, no one died. The locals counted themselves lucky to be alive, but Mother Nature was just getting started. Because 10 years later, it happened again. Only this time, it didn't hold back. In January 2005, California, it had been raining heavily for weeks. The ground was waterlogged and unstable. And then, without warning, a huge section of the previous landslide broke loose. But this wasn't the slow crack and crumble you see in disaster movies. This was a full-speed wall of liquefied mud, debris, and rock blasting through the town like a freight train. 13 houses were completely wiped out. Another 23 were smashed into splinters. 10 people were buried alive in their own homes. Rescue efforts were frantic. People dug through the mud with their bare hands, screaming out the names of their loved ones. Some victims were found hours later, but others weren't so lucky. After that, the lawsuits started flying. Families blamed the state, the county, land developers, just anyone who might have ignored the warnings. And those warnings weren't subtle. Geologists had flagged the area as unstable for decades. Locals knew about the 1995 slide, sure, but even before that, the land had a long history of moving. In 1909, a landslide in the same area buried a railroad track. La Conchita didn't just have two disasters. It's built on top of one that never really stopped. The bluffs are still moving. Rainy seasons still open up new cracks. And the warning signs are basically just there for decoration at this point. The question isn't if the land will move again, it's when. Crow Creek Massacre. A long time ago, around the 1300s, a group of initial coalescent people settled along the Missouri River, near what's now Chamberlain, South Dakota. They dug a trench around their village, not for farming, but for defense. Something about the times made them nervous. Unfortunately, they didn't finish it in time. When archaeologists later discovered that site, they found a mass grave inside the ditch that contained the bones of at least 486 people. Men, women, and kids. Most had been mutilated, skulls cracked open. Some had their limbs hacked off. Others were decapitated or scalped. A few even had their tongues cut out or teeth removed. This was, by all intents and purposes, a massacre. And what made it worse was what came before. These people hadn't been thriving when they were alive. Their bones showed signs of hunger, long-term malnutrition, and illness. The village was already struggling before the attackers even showed up. Archaeologists first found the site in the 1950s, and again in the 70s. The evidence was so brutal and so clear that no one doubted what it was. Experts studied the remains with care, and tribal leaders worked with them to make sure it was all done with respect. In 1981, the bones were reburied in the same ground they were found. Today, the Crow Creek site is a National Historic Landmark, and it's the largest known pre-Columbian massacre in North America. It's proof that long before the U.S. existed, people were still fighting over the same things. Land, food, power, and sometimes they lost everything. Heights Crematory Scandal. Heights Crematory was supposed to be one of those quiet places you don't think too hard about. You drop off your loved one, say your goodbyes, and trust that the people in charge will handle the rest with care. But instead of dignity and respect, families got something straight out of a nightmare. It started with whispers and a tip from the Illinois Funeral Directors Association. A few employees couldn't stomach what they were seeing every day and finally spoke up. What they described sounded like something from a horror show. But when investigators showed up at the facility, they realized that the employees had been telling the truth all along. Bodies were literally stacked on the floor. Some were dumped like trash on cold concrete, half covered in plastic bags and sheets. Others were crammed into broken down coolers, not refrigerated, just sitting there, decomposing. Then came the trailer. Investigators found it just sitting there like it was no big deal, except it held 19 corpses inside. There was no cooling system, and the corpses were piled on top of each other, decomposing into the floor. Somewhere on the premises, officials found over 500 boxes of ashes just sitting there, collecting dust. No one had claimed them, not because the families forgot, but because the management and staff never bothered to send them out. The deeper the authorities look, the worse it got. Paperwork was a mess, and tracking systems were non-existent. Families who thought they had closure were now wondering if they were given the wrong ashes, or if the ashes they received belonged to anyone at all. Illinois had never revoked a crematory's license like this before, but Heights didn't just break the rules, they lit them on fire. The facility was shut down permanently, and the owners were banned from ever operating again, but the damage was already done. The Heights crematory scandal reminded everyone that even in death, people aren't always treated with the respect they deserve. As horrifying as this is, the guy we're ending on was even more unhinged, and he never hid what he was. Tier 5. 1912 Forsyth County Racial Cleansing. Forsyth County, Georgia. In 1912, looks like your typical southern town. It was one of those places that was quiet, predictable, and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. Racial tensions were high, but it wasn't until one night when the locals heard a scream in the dark that everything really went south. A white woman named Ellen Grice claimed she woke up to find a black man standing in her room. Nobody was harmed and no proof was found at the scene, but the town was already on edge. And then things got worse. Just a few days later, 18-year-old May Crow, who was also white, was found in the woods. She had been beaten, assaulted, and was barely alive. She died not too long after. That's when the town stopped pretending to be civilized. Police arrested 16-year-old Ernest Knox, saying a cheap pocket mirror that had been sold to him at a local store somehow connected him to the attack. But that's not really what nailed him. Knox was tortured until he confessed. As in, they staged a fake lynching, tied a noose around his neck, hoisted him up, and held him there until he broke. Then came Rob Edwards, another black man who was implicated by Knox's false confession. He didn't even make it to court. A mob dragged him out of jail, shot him, beat him, and strung him up from a telephone pole in the town square. His corpse hung there while people laughed and threw rocks, and somehow that was only the beginning. Knox and Oscar Daniel, another black teenager, were both rushed through trials with all-white juries, because that's not biased at all. They were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. It was supposed to be a private execution, but word got out and thousands of people showed up. Some people even brought their kids. That's questionable parenting, to say the least. Just when it seemed like the tragedy was over, along came the night riders. White men on horseback rode through black neighborhoods at night, shouting threats and firing shots. Leave in 24 hours or we'll burn you out. Just to prove they weren't bluffing, the night riders smashed windows, slaughtered livestock, and fired straight into homes with families still inside. By the time it was over, Forsyth County had lost 98% of its black population. More than 1,000 black people ran for their lives, leaving everything behind from landed properties to family heirlooms. And if you're wondering what happened to all that stolen land, well, some of it became part of Lake Lanier. Yeah, that Lake Lanier. The one where people go boating and tubing and pretend not to know they're floating over parts of a flooded town called Oscarville. Ocoee Massacre. The day is November 2nd, 1920. It's election day in Ocoee, Florida, a small town just west of Orlando. The weather's fine, the polls are open, and black residents, many of them landowners, are lining up to vote. Sounds normal, right? Well, not exactly. This is the Jim Crow South. And while the Constitution says everyone has a right to vote, reality doesn't work like that here. For months, black organizers had been holding meetings, collecting receipts for poll taxes, and preparing to do something that shouldn't be revolutionary: casting a ballot. But some white residents weren't having it. The Ku Klux Klan had already marched through the streets the day before the election, warning black voters to stay home or else. That morning, a man named Mose Norman shows up at the polls. He's wealthy, educated, and unafraid. But when he tries to vote, he's shoved out and turned away for a flimsy reason. Some say he left quietly. Others say he came back with a shotgun. Either way, no shots were fired at the polls. But that didn't stop the rumors. That night, a mob of angry white people, most of whom were armed, set out to punish Norman for attempting to exercise his constitutional right. They got word that he was at the home of July Perry, who, of course, was also a black man, and so they marched straight to Perry's house. His daughter was inside, and she was shot almost as soon as they got there. Perry tried to defend his home. He fired back and managed to wound a few attackers. In the chaos, 2 white men were killed. Most likely by their own men, but of course, that didn't matter. Perry was arrested, beaten, dragged from jail, and lynched. They strung him up on a telephone pole in Orlando and left his body hanging there as a warning. And then came the real purge. White mobs stormed through Ocoee's black neighborhood, and they didn't hold back. Homes were set on fire. Lodges and churches burned. Some people were gunned down in streets, while others were beaten, mutilated, lynched. Families who tried to run were chased down. One woman and her pregnant daughter were found burned under their own porch. And not too far away, a man was castrated and left to die face down in the dirt. By morning, it was still not over. When the attack finally ended, the black community of Ocoee was gone. Their homes were gone too. But the land, that didn't disappear. It was taken. Deeds were seized, titles were transferred without consent, and white residents simply moved in like nothing had happened. For over 60 years, not a single black person lived in Ocoee. And today, if you drive through town, most people won't bring it up. Some didn't know, and others pretend not to. But the facts are simple. Ocoee had an ethnic cleansing, and it happened in plain sight under the American flag on Election Day. Dudleytown, Cursed Village. Way out in the quiet corners of northwest Connecticut, there's a stretch of forest that most people don't even realize has a name. No signs to point to it, and the locals don't exactly hand out directions. But if you ask around long enough or dig deep enough, you'll find out that it's called Dudleytown. It's not a town anymore, hasn't been for a long time. These days, it's just a cluster of ruins tucked deep inside something called the Dark Entry Forest, which honestly sounds like a place where people go missing on purpose. Sunlight barely makes it through the trees, and there's nothing left standing except some crumbling stone foundations, stone walls, and the stories people won't stop telling. The legend goes like this. Back in the 1740s, a group of settlers moved in, including members of the Dudley family, who, according to folklore, brought something nasty with them from England. The story claims they were cursed. One of their ancestors supposedly got executed for treason, and the curse followed the bloodline all the way to the colonies. Now, historians love to ruin the fun and say that the Dudleys in Connecticut weren't even related to the cursed ones from England. But facts never really stood a chance against this place's reputation. Over the next century, Dudley gained a name for being off. Crops failed, families fell apart, and people went missing. More than a few residents lost their minds or died under weird circumstances. And the land just wouldn't cooperate. The soil was bad, the water didn't taste right, and eventually everyone got tired of fighting it. So the town emptied out, house by house. Dudleytown never had a post office or a mayor, and eventually it had no people either. What didn't fall apart after everyone left got swallowed by the forest, and as the trees moved in, the rumors started to grow. By the late 20th century, the place had already picked up nicknames like the Cursed Village, or Connecticut's own Hellmouth, depending on who you asked. In the 1970s, ghost hunters started showing up. They brought cameras, tape recorders, and way too much confidence. Some swore they saw shadowy figures moving between the trees. Others said they heard whispers or felt watched. One Hollywood actor even called it the most haunted place on earth. I can think of a few worse places, but you get the point. Today, the whole area is closed off. It's private property, and trespassing isn't allowed. You'll get stopped by police if you try to sneak in, and they're not in the mood for ghost stories. The owners of the land have spent years trying to shut down the hype, but the legends just won't die. Maybe they never will. Dudleytown might just be a forgotten spot in the woods, but the legends haven't stopped. Whether it's a real curse or just centuries of bad press, Dudleytown's reputation still sends people into the woods, looking for answers they probably don't want. West Mesa Murders. In early 2009, a woman was out walking her dog on the edge of Albuquerque when she spotted something poking out of the dirt. It wasn't a rock, and it didn't look like animal remains either. When police started digging, they uncovered one of the most mysterious mass graves in American history. Buried beneath the cracked desert floor of West Mesa were the remains of 11 women and girls. Most of them were Hispanic, and they had all gone missing between 2001 and 2005. One victim was just 15. Another was 4 months pregnant, and all of them had been buried by someone who was crafty enough to never get caught. The media called him the West Mesa Bone Collector. Whoever he was, he buried the bodies in a dry arroyo on the outskirts of town, just far enough away to be forgotten, but close enough that no one would question the tire tracks in the dirt. Years later, satellite image showed faint tire tracks, changes in the dirt, and signs that something or someone had been regularly visiting that stretch of land and using it as a personal graveyard. He probably would have gotten away with it too if not for the housing crash in 2008. That land was supposed to be developed, but when the economy tanked, the project stopped, and with no bulldozers tearing the place up, the land stayed untouched, and the secret stayed hidden for a little longer. Now here's the part that makes it worse. Nearly all of the victims had ties to adult work and drugs, and that's exactly why the killer picked them. Or at least, that's what the theories say. They were women the system didn't prioritize, so even though some of their families did report them missing, not much happened. Some people think it wasn't just one killer. There's a theory that it could have been a trafficking ring moving women along highways, working the fairs, and dropping off whoever didn't make it. Albuquerque sits right in the middle of a lot of that traffic, and nobody was really watching. There were a few suspects, a known pimp, a landscaper with a criminal record involving minors, and then there was Lorenzo Montoya, a press operator with a history of hiring escorts and roughing them up. In 2006, he strangled a teenage girl and was caught red-handed trying to shove her into a car trunk. Her boyfriend shot him on the spot. When police searched his house, they found creepy footage of him filming what looked like a lifeless woman. Still, none of the West Mesa victims were linked to him directly. To this day, whoever did this, whether it was one man or a group, has never been identified. And for the site, a memorial park was built over part of it, and the surrounding area has been developed. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was born in 1891. By the time he was 8 years old, he was already drinking. By age 11, he was stealing from neighbors. And by the time he turned 14, he was burning down buildings. He hated people and believed the entire world deserved to suffer. So when he got his hands on someone, that's exactly what he made them do. In 1906, Panzram was locked up in a Montana reform school for burglary. He claimed that a guard beat him so badly he almost died. He retaliated by smashing the guard's face with a wooden plank. When he regained his freedom, Panzram went from town to town with an accomplice named James Benson. The two of them had a great time carrying out robberies and torching buildings. But, as the saying goes, all good things, or in this case, crime sprees, must come to an end. Panzram was enlisted in the military, got kicked out for theft and insubordination, and then went back to his life of crime. He was arrested over and over again for many different crimes, and at one point, he started using aliases. While he was locked up in many different prisons across the country, Panzram set up what you could call a prison routine. He planned escapes, some successful and some not, committed more assaults, and even claimed to have assaulted fellow prisoners. He called himself Rage Personified, and apparently that meant he didn't care about money, only control and pain. When Panzram was released from a Montana prison in 1915 with a suit and $5, he had no soul left, or at least that's what he said. He left Montana and went right back to his life of crime. He would hang out in train yards and back alleys, attacking and killing boys, men, and strangers. Basically, anyone who was unfortunate enough to cross paths with him. Also, Panzram didn't hide his crimes. He kept tabs on his victims, and even bragged about all the crimes he'd committed. As scary as it sounds, Montana was just the beginning, because from there, Carl Panzram went on to become one of the most violent killers in American history. No, seriously, that's how he earned a spot on this iceberg. He killed 5 people that we know of, confessed to 21 murders in total, and is suspected of having a body count of over 100. That's all we have for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Drop a comment if one of these stuck with you, or if your hometown was on the list. And who knows, maybe I'll make a part 2.